We're in a political season. There's a lot of political ferment and activity, and I want to talk about some background problems in my own way. These problems are not new to us, but I wanted to give them my slant, my interpretation, which I think will give us something to do if we don't have anything to do already. I want to start off with a personal sort of problem I had. For a long time, I had been vexed by a contradiction about American society that I just couldn't understand, even though the answer was staring me right in the face. The contradiction involves our economy. My problem was as follows. On the one hand, the official story handed down to us by our government spokespersons and conveyed to us by media pundits is that the American economy is simply in great shape. Just look at the data. The unemployment rate is down to a mere 3.5%, the lowest in 50 years. The economy has been expanding each year. The stock market is booming, and consumer spending is growing, which means more people are employed. The economy is growing ever larger, and so forth. But if the economy is in such great shape, how do we explain the fact that at the same time, 2 in 5, or 40% of Americans, have fewer than $400 in savings, putting them into panic mode with one car breakdown or one medical episode? If fear of coronavirus spreads, it is possible that people who now go to restaurants, hotels, and other places where folks gather will cease to do that, causing significant layoffs of workers, many of whom I think are financially on the edge. It will not be a good state of affairs, to say the least. A related reality is that 1 in 5 adults, in fact, is unable to pay the current month's bills in full. If the latter statistics are true, and I've heard them repeated over and over again from many sources, then is it possible that the economy is not as in great a shape as the official story would lead us to believe? How can both things be true? Okay, that was my perplexity. The answer to my perplexity came to me in an online article in the Atlantic magazine, which was shown to me a while back by Ed Gross, one of our members. And the article is entitled, "The Great Affordability Crisis Breaking America," subtitled, quote, "In one of the best decades the American economy has ever recorded, families were bled dry," end quote. The answer to the conundrum, as implied, is quite obvious, and is lodged in the reality that the costs for basic necessities of life have risen tremendously, I want to say astronomically, in the recent past. The author of the article, Ann Lowry, outlines 4 such blocks of necessary expenses. The first, and the most acute part of the crisis, is the rising cost of housing. In some urban centers, such as Boston, Seattle, and the Bay Area, and we can add Manhattan if we like, the price of homes has soared to the point that it is simply unaffordable for low and middle income people to live there. San Francisco is perhaps the most extreme, where the median cost of a single family home is now $1.6 million. That means an average mortgage of $6,000 a month, right? I'm not moving, let me tell you. But home prices are rising faster in 80% of America's urban areas, and the rising cost of housing extends to rural areas as well, where income growth lags more severely. Today, people in rural areas spend half their income on housing. Traditionally, as many of you may recall, the figure was usually given as 1/3 of one's income would go to housing. Now in many places, including poor sectors of the country, it demands 1/2 of their income. As a result, we are increasingly becoming a nation of renters, with millennials and Gen Xers having a home ownership rate that is 8% lower than that of their parents when they were the same age. This means that they are delaying their wealth accumulation and may have worse net worth trajectories for the rest of their lives. But even as people are renting more, they are having more difficulty paying their rent, given that rent has been rising faster than income for the last 20 years. Okay. And then there is healthcare, which has become exorbitant. Personally speaking, when I was approaching 65, it was the only time in my adulthood when I actually looked forward to getting older. Okay? Don't mess with my Medicare, please. don't touch it, okay? Since the recession, medical costs keep rising, eating away at family budgets, casting millions of people in debt, and consigning millions of people to bankruptcy. Private family health insurance premiums have now risen, okay, if you pay for it yourself, to $17,710 a year, and deductibles have gone up very quickly, so they have now reached an average of about $3,000 a year. 140 million Americans report what they call medical financial hardship each year, according to the author of this article. Next, there is the cost of child care, which is simply crushing. According to this piece, spending on daycare nannies and other direct services for children has risen 2,000% in the past 4 decades, and families now commonly spend, if they can, $15,000 to $20,000 to have someone watch their kid. My son, who is a doctor, once complained to me that what he paid for after-school programs for his kids felt like he was paying for college tuition, and he really felt pinched by it. While these costs would put a tremendous strain on middle-class families, as you can imagine, like my son, it is simply unaffordable for the poor, causing many people to drop out of the labor force altogether. Now, child care has become the largest single item in many people's budgets, greater than their rent or their mortgage. But then 1 in 4 mothers do return to work 2 weeks after giving birth. So heavy are the other financial demands. In other words, it's simply a tremendous financial squeeze. And finally, there is student debt, which, if you go to college, which 15 million adults are stuck paying off to the total. The total is an unbelievable in this country, $1.6 trillion, okay? Now, by comparison, okay, in the 1980s, to be personal, my wife and I were able to see 5 of our children through college on very modest salaries, which included 3 who went to private colleges, and 1 who went to medical school, a 2nd who went to law school, and a 3rd who got her doctorate, albeit from a public university. I should also mention that I was pursuing my own doctorate at the same time, much of which at a private school, Columbia, much of which I had to pay for. Today, I would probably have to take out a home equity line to send a single child to a private university, which would probably I'd never pay off. I'd die before, in effect, it became totally due. I assume that what causes this, among other things, is simply a huge escalation in college tuitions, and that's the greatest variable. But send a kid to college today, and you may be indebting your family beyond a single generation. I've even heard, and this may be apocryphal, it sounds outlandish, that there are people who actually take their college loan debts out of their Social Security checks. In other words, you can work out with the government a deal where they will subtract it from your Social Security check if you need to. And I don't know if that's true. I mean, I've heard that. It may be apocryphal, okay? Yeah, it's a whole other discussion, but in my view, the system of college financing has simply become unsustainable.
It's not true.
These are the big blocks of fixed costs that keep the middle class on the edge and simply push the poor over it. Add to this the pervasive fact that almost half of U.S. workers between the ages of 18 and 64 are employed in low-wage jobs that pay median hour wages of $10.22 per hour. Now, that's above the federal wage of minimum wage of 7.25 cents an hour, but well below what's considered the living wage for many regions of the country. To sum it up, Robert Reich, who is our Secretary of Labor, as you recall, under Bill Clinton, writing in The Guardian, had noted, quote, "There are legions of college grads who are overqualified for their jobs, a growing number of contract workers with no job security, and an army of part-time workers desperate for full-time work. Almost 80% of Americans say they live from paycheck to paycheck, many not knowing how big their next one will be. Blanketing all of this are stagnant wages and vanishing job benefits. The typical American worker now earns about $44,500 a year, not much more than what a typical worker earned, 40 years ago, adjusted for inflation. Although the U.S. economy continues to grow, Most of the gains have been going to a relatively few top executives of large companies, financiers and investors, and owners of digital services. What's going on, Reich asks? Well, simply put, the vast majority of American workers have lost just about all their bargaining power. The erosion of that bargaining power is one of the biggest economic stories of the past 4 decades, yet it's less about supply and demand than about institutions and politics. Indeed, we've destroyed the labor union movement in this country. I think fewer than 10%, maybe 7% of all workers are now unionized. You can thank Ronald Reagan for setting that in motion. And if we're looking for something to do in a political season, I think it's rebuilding the labor movement in this country, which ethical culture historically very proudly was involved in doing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Despite all the hoopla about a robust economy, to my untutored mind, this does not make for a strong, secure, robust economy, but one riddled with insecurity and anxiety, and perhaps most consequentially, one in which the doors of rising opportunity are slammed shut. The short story is that the American dream, the idea that you can start off poor and through grit and hard work your way up the ladder into the middle class, that visionary aspiration, in fact, friends, is stalled, if not dead. Nowadays, the chances are that if you are born into poverty, you'll never work your way out of it. Upward mobility today is greater in socialist Sweden than it is in the United States. As we all know, America is viciously divided these days in many ways, especially politically. We have become searingly tribal, and political discourse has become very nasty at all levels. There are many complex reasons for this. Among them is the changing demography of America and the arrival of new immigrants bringing with them new cultures, new values, and different skin pigmentations. People generally feel more secure and more at home with people like themselves. To be among those like oneself reinforces one's own identity, introduces difference, and it raises people's feelings to a level of discomfort. But I believe beneath the rapid demographic changes, Americans are experiencing the tectonic economic dynamics that I've been outlining, which have led to the fragmenting and fraying of the American social fabric. When the doors of economic opportunity are closed, it cuts off feelings of hope. Hope for oneself and hope for one's children. Hopelessness, in turn, causes people to turn inward, I think, to form more parochial allegiances. In other words, to become more tribal. And as we know, tribalism centers not only around racial and ethnic identities, but these days around political and social values and issues, be it involving guns, abortion, gender identity and rights, immigration, government spending, and whether one positions oneself or is identified as standing on the liberal or conservative end of the political spectrum. People want to identify, as noted, with others like themselves with regard to such issues, and we cannot underestimate the power of the human bond, which often supersedes other forms of self-interest, even one's own economic self-interest. Another vexing question that, I sort of still have trouble with, and many of us do as well, a question that often presents itself these days is why is it that elements of the white working class who occupy the lower rungs of the economic ladder will nevertheless support positions that deprive them of their own economic wherewithal, even to the extent of rejecting government programs that involve providing health benefits for themselves and their own children. Part of the answer, I think, involves this penchant towards tribalism and bonding with others of their class who share the same political value system. But this tribalism is fueled also, I believe, by a heavy dose of resentment, a disposition which the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche knew about very well. I do believe that many will deprive themselves of the benefits of economic programs because they feel that the paternalistic hand of government is taking from them what is rightfully theirs in order to give what they earn, perhaps to minorities in urban areas or to new arrivals whom they deem to be undeserving. And by taking such a position, however economically self-depriving, they perhaps feel that they are preserving a stance of moral superiority. I think it's resentment, in effect, that fuels a lot of that, even their own economic self-deprivation, even if the health of their own children may be put into jeopardy. I mean, it was Nicholas Kristof who did an op-ed, I think it was about a year or so ago, where he went to Oklahoma and he interviewed some of these rural white folks who were, you know, sort of economically on the edge. And they understood that Obamacare was going to help. It was a few years ago, obviously, that Obamacare was going to help them and their children, and yet they still rejected it, okay, for these reasons of, you know, of resentment and so on, I believe. It's a sad and perverse view, and one which helps divide Americans against each other by class, by region, by ethnicity and race, and all too viciously by political orientation. But behind it all, I believe, is the macro issue of the huge wealth gap in our society and the closing of the doors of economic viability and opportunity. The extraordinary wealth of the super rich who control the economy not only divides the country economically, but ultimately causes it to fracture politically into insular and mutually hostile tribes or groups through forestalling, again, upward mobility for the masses of Americans, okay, with its consequent frustrations and anger. I'm not the only one to feel this way. This analysis is simply not my own. I'm not that smart. Amy Chua, who is a professor at Yale Law School, had written, quote, very simply, if any way out exists out of tribalism, it will have to be both economic and cultural. Restoring upward mobility should be viewed as an emergency. Upward mobility is what made America different from developing countries that have disintegrated. Research shows, she says, that zero-sum political tribalism is worst under conditions of economic insecurity and lack of opportunity. But let me move on. That's the economic story. The American fabric is fraying in other ways, that is socially, which brings the problem.
Let's try some new batteries.
Which brings the problem.
No idea what the problem is.
Okay. As I'm saying, the American fabric is fraying in other ways. That is socially, okay, which I think brings the problem locally, brings it closer to home. The most painful and dramatic consequences of this sort of fraying of the social fabric, I think, are the skyrocketing number of what are called deaths of despair. It's gotten a lot of press. That is, deaths resulting from suicide, alcoholism, and drug overdoses, particularly the opioid epidemic. It's a plague that has afflicted, again, mostly older white males in the poorer sectors of society, focused, for example, on Appalachia, but not only Appalachia, with more than, the numbers are staggering, with more than 150,000 people dying of such cases in 2017, the last year I could find data for. Suicide among teenagers and millennials has also risen greatly, and of course is very disturbing. More people, in fact, die of these causes every 2 weeks than all the Americans who were killed in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq combined, okay? And certainly far more than die as a result of firearms, okay? So great are the numbers that for 3 years in a row, the average life expectancy of Americans overall had actually declined, and this is the only time this has ever happened in modern times in a rich country. Now, this past 12 months, it's actually ticked back up again in terms of the average, because there has been some success in rapid interventions with opioid epidemics, but the numbers are so large that it's brought down the average life expectancy.
Why don't you switch mics?
So great are the numbers, again, that, as I'm saying, that life expectancy for 3 years in the United States, actually the average life expectancy actually declined somewhat. We've made a few gains. It's ticking back up a little bit. Now, there are many causes for this. No doubt the economic, and primarily the economic deprivations and pressures I previously noted being the most pressing, but there are others. As Ann Case, a Princeton academic, she's written extensively about this, and she stated the pillars that once helped give life meaning, that is a good job, a stable home life, and a voice in the community, she says, have all eroded. As implied, there are social causes beyond economic ones as well. Which leads, again, to the second aspect of the fraying of American society that should concern us. And that is the unraveling of social bonds and social institutions which serve to enrich our lives. There has been a lot of literature written in the past 20 years on what has come to be known in social science circles as social capital. Okay, it's a very simple idea. Social capital simply means the health of interpersonal relations in American communities. It can refer to the strength of public and private institutions like the family, the church, community organizations, and platforms for constructive political dialogue. Examples of social capital might be things as simple as, and this is a quote, when a group of neighbors informally keep an eye on one another's homes. That's social capital. When a tightly knit community of Hasidic Jews trade diamonds without having to test each gem for purity, that's social capital. Barn raising on the frontier was social capital in action, and so too are email exchanges among members of a cancer support group. Social capital can be found in friendship networks, neighborhoods, churches, schools, bridge clubs, civic associations, and even bars. In other words, it's people getting together to reinforce each other, to strengthen the human bond, and so on. That's social capital. Interest in the strength of institutions that make for social capital was launched by the Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam in his book, some of you may have remembered it, called Bowling Alone, that was written in 2000, and that book became a bestseller. Putnam observed that while more people were taking up bowling, far fewer Americans were bowling in leagues that brought people socially together. That became exemplary of the fact that fewer Americans, as he found, were active in social and civic organizations, be it fraternal organizations like Kiwanis or Knights of Columbus or whatever, that sort of thing, political organizations, churches, and clubs of all sorts. You know, it was Alexis, you can't talk about America without talking about Alexis de Tocqueville. Everybody has to. And he wrote in, Democracy in America in the 1830s. And one of the things he noticed that was distinctive about Americans, I think this is true, unlike Europeans, is that they had a penchant for doing things in clubs. Americans liked together in club-like organizations in ways in which Europeans did not. But Putnam's finding is that that sort of old American trope, that habit, has been disintegrating. Americans don't do it so much anymore. Now, he does admit that they do join organizations, as we all do, like AARP or the ACLU in large numbers, but these are not the kinds of affiliations that bring people together in face-to-face relations, that strengthen social bonds and strengthen the social capital. So, for example, just some data. Over the past 25 years, Putnam reports that there have been 58% fewer Americans attending club meetings, and 43% fewer people engage in family dinners. Okay, don't eat dinner with their families. Okay, and there's a 45% decline in people having friends come over to the home. That doesn't happen so much anymore. In recent years, there's been a plunge in Americans living with a relative, from 92 to 79%. Some of this is due to people living longer, which is not a bad thing, or postponing marriage, but part of it is also due to more people not getting married at all and choosing not to have children. The share of adults who said that they spent a social evening with a neighbor at least several times a week fell from 30% in 1974 to just 19% in 2016. Even as people spend less time with their neighbors, their neighborhoods, or these neighborhoods where they live, are becoming more economically segregated so that people get even less exposure and interaction to people who are not like them. So there is simply more social isolation, and the effect is that there is, and this has been reported, much greater loneliness in American society. People report that they are just more lonely, and that is not a good thing. More people, moreover, are living in a self-selected bubble, insulated and isolated from interaction with other people. These weaker ties bleed into attitudes about other people. From 1972 to 2016, the share of adults who thought most people could be trusted declined from 46 to 31%. And I'd like to tell this anecdote about my own childhood. Okay, when I was a kid, my mom died in 1960 when I was 12. And before she died, she was not an arrant permissivist, but she permitted, I grew up in Forest Hills, Queens. She, in effect, permitted me to ride on the subway when I was like 11 years old by myself. Sometimes I'd go with a friend up to Yankee Stadium, and sometimes I'd go to the Museum of Natural History, and if I'd go with a friend, it was fine. If I couldn't find a friend, I went by myself. But it was not uncommon for me to get on the subway, and New York was great. I mean, it was like going to the Emerald City to go to Manhattan. It was phenomenal. As a kid, by yourself, I could walk around and explore the city on my own. What freedom, you know, and so on and so forth. And I remember my mom, I've told this to friends, I remember my mom saying to me, and she would be picked up and arrested for child abuse today, but she would say to me, Joseph, she's the only person I know who called me Joseph, she'd say, Joseph, if you get lost or need help, approach a stranger and ask them to help you, okay? Now that's interesting. She taught me, don't get into a car with a stranger. She was clear about that, but the assumption was very different, and this is a big change in society, and I don't think it's a good one. And that is, I grew up as a kid, and I still feel this way, I'm not a fearful person. I grew up as a kid feeling that the world outside was a friendly place, that adults were there to care for me, right? Strangers. Today, I think kids grow up with exactly the opposite feeling, that the world out there is a fearsome place, and you have to be very cautious. Now, that doesn't mean in the 1950s there weren't creeps walking around and guys who would expose themselves and all kinds of stuff, but the social geist, the feeling of the time, I think, was indeed very, very different. And the assumption was, and I think it was correct, that adults in general felt not everyone, of course, making generalization, but adults in general felt a responsibility for everyone's child, okay? And I will dare to quote a source, which I would never otherwise quote, okay? And that's Antonin Scalia. I remember seeing a TV show, and he was right about this. Antonin Scalia grew up in a working class neighborhood in Elmhurst, Queens, not far from where I grew up. And this was like a TV show, I don't know, it was 60 Minutes or something. And he went back to his childhood neighborhood, walking around the street and talking to the interviewer. And he gave an anecdote which has stuck with me because I thought it was very true. He said that as a kid, you know, as an adolescent, he would ride on city buses, right, and put his feet up on the seat. I would do that too, okay? I still do it. Right on the seat, you know, and put his feet up on the seat in front of him, and some guy would come over and say, hey, you know, Sonny, get your feet off the seat. That's not what buses are for, right? I mean, there was a sense that there was a responsibility of adults in general to socialize everybody's kid, and that's not a bad thing. And Scalia had commented, and here I was sympathetic, you know, he had commented that that aspect in American society has basically evaporated. It's gone, and there's a real change in American life, and again, I don't think it's a good thing. There was a time when grandma, including my grandma, would sit in the sunroom looking out the window. She was like the neighborhood watch, do you know what I'm saying, looking at the street to see if there was anything going on. I don't think that, or people would sit on stoops in front of their houses. That doesn't go on in the same way, and as a result, the whole, what I'm calling social capital has in many ways, I think, unfortunately, eroded in a way that's not good. Okay, now, to move on, the strength of social capital, I think, is tightly bound up with economic capacity and plays itself out in a vast disconnect between the privileged and unprivileged classes in society, which will no doubt only create a more desperate American future unless we create the economic and social programs that we will rebuild a more egalitarian future and again reopen the doors of opportunity. Okay, Robert Putnam, in other words, there are class differences, all right? And I want to talk about that. Robert Putnam is still hammering away at this issue, and in 2017, he testified before Congress. Congress actually looked at the issue, can't imagine it, looking at the issue of social capital. He testified in Congress on the economic and social divisions in American society, and he illustrated the following comparison. Okay, this is sort of a nice narrative. He says, quote, rich kids and poor kids are now growing up in separate and unequal Americas, their fates increasingly and unfairly tied to, quote, in quotes, their choice of parents and the zip code in which they are born. In a gated community in Southern California, for example, Jeanette, a stay-at-home mother of 3, spends her summer days driving her daughters to tennis and swimming lessons, shopping for nutritious family meals, researching colleges, and planning charity events. Her youngest daughter, Alyssa, works with a college essay tutor in the morning and then trains 6 hours a day with her elite private swimming coach. Spending $20,000 a year on her coach is worth it. Jeanette and her 6-figure earning husband believe if swimming helps Alyssa get into a prestigious college. Meanwhile, 20 minutes down the freeway, Natalie, a single mom out of work from a back injury, peers anxiously at a fast food menu, deciding whether to use her last few dollars on lunch or on gas. Her talented daughter, Lila, has won numerous awards at school, and Natalie always makes it to the ceremonies. But unlike Alyssa, Lila doesn't have a writing tutor, a private coach, or a college fund to help her into the future. She spends her afternoons working at Bergen, pinning her hopes for a better life on a dubious for-profit college and tens of thousands of dollars in loans. And these stories crystallize the growing inequality of opportunity in America, the opportunity gap that is experienced across all stages of a child's life, okay? Is this, I mean, what I'm talking about sensible to you? I mean, in terms of differences of opportunity that start very, very early and are very stark now, I think, in American life. He goes on to say, poor and working class kids like Lila increasingly grow up in fragile families and neighborhoods where food and housing are insecure, resources are scarce, crime is high, relationships are volatile, and stress is toxic, leaving them too isolated and distrusted to develop the skills, knowledge, and social networks crucial for success. The affluence or poverty of neighborhoods is concentrated at different schools that the Lilas and Alyssas attend. The test score gap between rich kids and poor kids is large, but exists well before kids even enter school. The Lilas of the world leave high school without the social connections and resources to land unpaid internships or quality jobs, without the test prep, lacking quality counseling from family or professionals to navigate college applications, and without the financial aid and, quote, savvy to choose realistic and economically productive careers, okay? We live in two worlds, okay? That is the point. And, you know, the whole penchant of privatization adds to this. You know, I remember reading in a book by Michael Sandel, who's a very influential political theorist at Harvard. He was giving examples of this, and he said, you know, there was a time when you went to Yankee Stadium or whatever, and the executive, the CEO, sat in a seat next to the guy who was mopping the floors or whatever, okay? You had people intermingling. Today, if you're wealthy, you can buy for hundreds of thousands of dollars an exclusive private seat, okay, at the stadium, separating you, indeed, from the masses. And that really is a metaphor for the way in which American society is dividing itself, and it starts very young. Well, as Putnam says, such are the differences that separate the privileged from unprivileged families. But I want to end this survey, and I'm bringing this to a close, of the American economics and social landscape by looking briefly at the family itself as an institution and its relationship to social capital. Now, I say this with a lump in my throat. David Brooks, whom is someone whom I have a love-hate relationship with. The New York Times is sort of my morning Bible reading. David Brooks, there are things about him I can't stand. I think he is self-important, unctuous, oily, and so forth, and conservative, and I do not agree very often with the conclusions that he draws. But I have to be honest, he very often talks at the level of values that lie beneath the journalistic stories that he's dealing with. And as an ethical culture leader, I appreciate the discourse with values and so on and so forth. So on that level, I like him. By the way, I should say, I write letters to the New York Times frequently, but always when I'm angry about something. And on Friday, he had the worst op-ed editorial I'd ever read. And here I shouldn't do this because when I'm standing here, I can't be partisan, all right? So I'll try not to be partisan. But he had this horrible op-ed where he was making, again, as so many people have made, this false equality between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, okay? Both are populists, and he said, I will end up voting for neither of them. Really, right? He's really going to not vote for Bernie Sanders and let Donald Trump in. I mean, it's really something that I find extraordinary, but his argument was basically, again, it was a false equality, and he doesn't recognize, it makes no difference to him that Trump is an inveterate liar and a pathological narcissist and every bad thing we could think of, whereas whether you like his politics or not, Bernie Sanders is a man of principle and I think great integrity, and that means something, and that somehow was totally lost in David Brooks' analysis. And so I had a lot of trouble when I wrote it, but I don't know if they'll print it. I have a good success rate in getting printed. I'd say about 30% of the letters I send to the Times actually get published, because you have to know how to do it, all right? You got to be somewhat high-minded. It's good if you have a stake in the issue. In this case, I don't, but a stake in the issue, and you got to be a little bit snobby in the way you know how to sort of manipulate the system, but I've done that pretty well. I've gotten a lot of letters published, right? Usually if you have a stake in it, which I don't here, that's your best option, you know, if you somehow relate it. So we'll see. I mean, they may get back to me and publish. It's not brilliant, it's just really angry. Too angry. Anyway, David Brooks did write the cover story for The Atlantic, which I do like, because the articles are very, very well written. The cover story in this month's Atlantic, called it's provocative, "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake." All right? And he makes a very interesting point, okay? And that makes the point that when we think of family, what comes to mind is indeed the nuclear family. That is a family made up of 4 people, comprised of a father, a mother, and 2.3 kids, right? As an independent, standalone unit, sort of the Ozzie and Harriet idea. But this contention is that ideal concept of the family, according to David Brooks, actually had a very brief lifespan in American history. From the beginning of the Republic until 1920, more or less, when we were prevailingly agricultural and then industry caught on in the late 19th century. But until the 1920s, more or less, Americans lived not in nuclear families, but in large multi-general extended families, here's my water, replete with grandparents, in-laws, aunts and uncles, cousins, and so forth. While there was very little privacy in such households, and they could no doubt be stifling, there were also strengths. In many ways, these families were very resilient. With 10 or 20 people in the same family, if a parent died, others could step in. If a member lost a job, financial support was immediately available. There was also a large cadre of adults to help socialize children towards moral values and behavior. From 1950 until 1965, the nuclear family was in its heyday, but since then, David Brooks noticed, it has been unraveling and is in decline. Not that the nuclear family was ideal. It certainly wasn't for women who were trapped in the home in demeaning circumstances and in many cases barred from employment if they were married. And that was true of my mother. I mean, she had a college degree but never worked outside the home. The marriage was not a good one. And my father was so pathologically stingy that my mom had to actually borrow money from her sister in order to sustain our household. That was not a good situation. It was demeaning and so on. So the 50s were hardly an idyllic time for most women. And whereas companies would hire women if they were single or if they were widowed, if you were married, you could not find employment in corporations. Hardly, and you think of the ideal family. You know, family is not such a great institution anyway. I don't know if you really. But anyway, according to Brooks, the nuclear family is disintegrating. He notes, and here's more data to let you. Americans today have less family than ever before. From 1970 to 2012, the share of households consisting of married couples with kids has been cut in half. In 1960, according to census data, just 13% of all households were single-person households. In 2018, that figure was 28%. In 1850, that goes back a long way, 75% of Americans older than 65 lived with relatives. By 1990, only 18% did. Over the past 2 generations, people have spent less and less time in marriage. They are marrying later, if at all, and divorcing more. In 1950, 27% of marriages ended in divorce. Today, about 45% do. You know, I look at that and I got to say, with a little bit of glee. I've officiated probably 700 marriages in my career, not recently. We've lost a lot of market share to the Universal Life Church. But I've done a lot, right? And anybody, it's become egalitarianized, which I favor, actually. Anybody, Uncle Charlie can marry you if you want in most places, which is fine. I'm not arguing. But I think sometimes I meet couples or meet someone in a marriage and they'll come up to me and say, hey, you officiated a marriage 40 years ago, and they'll say they're still married. I think my batting average is over 50%, right? And so I'm a little bit ahead of the the divorce rate. Not that I make any promises, once the ceremony is over, I have no more responsibility. But anyway, it's nice to know that my folks are probably doing a little bit better than the average divorce. And anyway, in 1960, 72% of American adults were married. In 2017, nearly half of American adults were single. According to a 2014 report from the Urban Institute, whatever that is, roughly 90% of baby boomer women and 80% of Gen X women married by age 40, while only about 70% of late millennial women were expected to do so, the lowest rate in US history. And while more than 4/5 of American adults in a 2019 Pew Research Center survey said that getting married is not essential to a fulfilling life, it's not just the institution of marriage they're eschewing. In 2004, 33% of Americans ages 18 to 34 were living without a romantic partner. According to the General Social Survey, by 2018, that number was up to 51%. In other words, the family is disintegrating, couples are disintegrating, people are more alone, isolated, and so forth. And then he continues to say, over the past 2 generations, families have also gotten a lot smaller. The general American birth rate is half of what it was in 1960. In 2012, most American family households had no children. There are more American homes with pets than with kids. In 1970, about 20% of households had 5 or more people. As of 2012, only 9.6% did. People, again, are living more fragmented lives. And Brooks notes, as the anecdotes I cited from Putnam before indicated, the wealthy, in fact, can purchase the support services they need to sort of extend their family, but for the poor, once again, the disintegration of the family has been simply devastating. And according to David Brooks, African American families have suffered disproportionately, which should not come as a surprise. The erosion of the nuclear family, of course, is hard on kids, but also on the elderly. According to AARP, 35% of Americans over 45 say that they are chronically lonely, and many older Americans are, quote, elderly orphans, end quote, with no close relatives or friends to take care of them. Clearly, American society faces formidable problems, and it is always easier to develop an analysis than it is to formulate solutions. By the way, I've been in academia long enough to suffer from that academic disease that is big on analysis, short on prescription. Okay, that's what academics do. All right, they make a living doing a lot of research analyzing problems, but when you say, okay, resolve the problems that you've now generated, well, they begin to become much more, not quite so wordy, which is true of me too. These are very big problems, but I don't believe, let me just say, I'm not a pessimist, I don't believe that they are insoluble. And we should derive hope that this political season has in fact revived political energy and activism with ideas and proposals coming from the progressive end of the political agenda that recognize these problems, I think, and what is at stake in terms of the viability of American society. The solutions will come from both government above and from people at the local level below, from the grassroots. With regard to solutions from above, I do believe again that the linchpin is prevalently economic. We have to muster the political will and the political pressure to rearrange the tax structure in this country to close the obscene wealth gap and move us towards greater egalitarianism. Putting yet more wealth in the hands of the super wealthy on the phony assumption that they will create more jobs and strengthen the economy is a total scam that will simply generate more cynicism, misery, and desperation, and will further erode, I think, a democratic culture and democratic institutions. Bluntly, it's an economic philosophy that is the handmaiden to political fascism. Rather, what we need is the allocation of wealth that will serve the common good and foster human and social capital. We need free child care and preschool, free public higher education, enlightened job training, a massive effort to build affordable and subsidized housing, and yes, a national healthcare system that includes, as it does in much of Europe, assisted living for people as they age. That is one of the biggest anxieties. And let me tell you, I've reached the age, and all of us, most of us in this room, have to have that anxiety. What the hell is going to happen? Am I going to, in effect, I have some savings, and the fear is I'll have to piss it all away in the last year of my life, in some exorbitant institution that I don't want to be in before I die. In Europe, you don't have that problem in most countries because their federal health care programs do indeed cover assisted living for the aged, and it reduces a huge anxiety in the minds of people as they get older, and I would love to have that system opposed. Let me just say, I'm not opposed to the market system, but it works best, I think, when it is focused on human needs and human welfare and works in cooperation with government to foster the fulfillment of human potentials and aspirations. And I would not be opposed, frankly, and I don't know how politically we can do this, but I'd love to do it, I would not be opposed to putting a cap on wealth. Okay, maybe we ought to say to all those investors, after you collect a certain amount of interest, okay, on all your stock portfolios and investments, we're going to tax that very, very, very heavily. Okay, after you've made your first $1 billion, what in the world are you going to do with your second billion? Okay, and we can use that money to spread around and really make the society viable and restore our democracy as we do it. For those who are dour pessimists, okay, I can only say that in fact America has been here before, and this is where history, I think, can be salutary. The Gilded Age of the robber barons, remember late 19th century, early 20th century, the Gilded Age of the robber barons and the oppressions of untold millions in the factories and tenements of America was answered by the progressive era, working from both the top and the grassroots. And the ethical culture movement was part of the progressive movement, okay? And what it did was it paved the way for the New Deal, the unionization of the working class, and it created thereby the most robust middle class the world has ever known. And I think most people in this room who grew up after World War II were beneficiaries of that, okay? And it started with the progressive era, working at all levels, from the top, from TR, Theodore Roosevelt, all the way to settlement houses that the ethical culture movement developed, and so on the ground, to basically transform the nature of the American economy. We did it once before, and I have to have the faith that we can do it again. And when it comes to stitching society together on the local level in neighborhoods, communities, and families, I think we already see some light shining. The recession of 2008 has begun to push Americans towards greater reliance on their families. Today, how many people have their kids returning home, living with them, right? You live in a multi-generational household, right? In effect, today, multi-generational families are actually beginning to increase, with 20% of Americans living, in fact, in multi-generational families. Many grandparents I know, when I talk to people, are choosing to live closer to their grandchildren rather than retiring to Florida or to Arizona. According to Brooks, there is a greater request of builders, this is a middle-class solution, a greater request for builders to construct homes that are designed to put two homes under one roof, so to speak, to allow family members to move in, but at the same time retain their privacy. And as Brooks notes, there is a movement in various parts of the country for non-related people to come together, live in proximity, to form the equivalent of functional extended families with shared responsibilities. Okay, there's actually a movement. I don't witness it. I don't have my hand on it, but I've heard reports, and I know people who know of this movement, of people who are not related, do not have kinship relations, but move closer together in order to play the role of mutual support of extended families. I want to mention, I know I'm going on, I want to mention one more thing, because it ties ethical culture into this, and it relates to it beautifully. In the 1920s, our founder, Felix Adler, was the chairman of a municipal housing commission in New York City that planned two communities as planned communities in the New York area. One was Sunnyside, Queens, and the other, believe it or not, was Radburn in Fair Lawn. And Radburn is how many people live in Fair Lawn? There you go. How many people live in Radburn? Okay, there you are. And maybe you can testify and you can shoot me down if you want, and you can, get Felix Adler to turn over his grave. but he was actually the chairman of a committee that designed Radburn, and it was based on his pluralistic metaphysical philosophy that was very esoteric, but it was put into practical operation with the way in which he thought about how people should live. And if you go to Radburn, or if you live there, you know it's made up of a collection of small homes, modest homes, that all open out into a common backyard, right? So it's the question, Adler had a philosophy of pluralism, the one and the many, okay, and the dialectic between the one and the many. And Radburn is actually an expression of that type of dynamic pluralistic philosophy where you can live in your own place, but you also engage in shared, okay, experience with your neighbors through having a common space, a common backyard in which you can basically enrich, as I'm saying in this address, enrich your social capital, okay? That's an interesting idea, and I think building neighborhoods, I'm almost done, okay? Building neighborhoods along those models really would be very salutary in terms of trying to address the isolation that people have in the way in which we live now. Well, I'm bringing this absolutely to an end. I know you've been very patient with the technology and all the data and all that stuff, okay? In this regard, I want to end by sharing a personal dream I have long had for this community, our Ethical Culture Society, wherein I think we could make a contribution to this very effort. There may be a need for it, it may be feasible, or just an unrealistic utopian aspiration and pipe dream, okay? And that notion, which I think would merit, frankly, ongoing discussion here, is whether we could actually thicken our own community, I mean this community, by reformulating it and restructuring it to more deeply meet the needs of our members. We do some of this, but I wonder if we could dig even deeper. I could imagine, for example, that we would reestablish a babysitting co-op. Okay, now, it wasn't under the aegis of this group, but for years, members of the society had established a babysitting co-op that was, Lisa Schwartz, who's not here, but I don't know how many were involved in it. Ron, you were, well, I'm saying Lisa, Ron doesn't. Right, Ron's a parent too. That in effect, the Schwartzes were involved and others were involved in a very successful babysitting co-op, which involved sharing responsibility for each other's children. Or perhaps we could build into our institutional life a situation where older members whose own children have been long grown would care for the younger children of our younger members, whose own, we could perhaps routinely provide ride services for each other. So instead of calling Uber, you could call on each other. Perhaps we could set up a skills bank where members would share their skills with other members and we would perform services for each other on the basis of barter arrangements. Perhaps we could marshal some serious financial resources, really serious, to support fellow members in times of job loss, either as gifts or as interest-free loans. This deeper-reaching community would emerge out of the needs of our members and the skills and devotion of those dedicated to meeting those needs. Well, creating such a community, I think, would be an admirable way to work to stitch together the American fabric in our very small corner of the larger landscape. It would bring us closer together. It would also be an exemplary and wonderful expression of humanism in action. Humanism as a lived philosophy that would bring greater meaning and riches to us all, okay? In these times, I think we need to foster creative programs, sustain our activism, and let us be inspired by glorious visions. We need to keep our feet on the ground, but our eyes on the stars. Thanks.